on non-muscle invasive bladder cancer. The aim of the exercise is to uh, update what has currently been the standards of care in superficial bladder cancer. So, let me begin right away. Bladder cancer, as we are aware, is the seventh most common form of cancer in males, and it is less commonly seen in women. Amongst the most important etiological aspects to consider is the association of smoking. A history of smoking is very important in these patients to be established, and it's not only smoking but the use of tobacco in general. Often patients deny smoking, but if you probe them more closely, they will stop uh, by saying that yes, they have been using uh, tobacco as a chewing habit, and therefore it's important to find out very carefully the history of smoking. Most of these cancers, at least 75%, are superficial, which is non-muscle invasive, which is the focus of what we are speaking today. Well, the disease of non-muscle invasive is a uh, it comprises of TA disease, which are the papillomas. Papillomas, as we understand, most often are low grade. However, there are also papillomas of a high grade. The common misconception is that a TA disease is only low grade. However, high grade TAs are known. The T1 disease comprises two subgroups, A and B. A is where the disease is superficial, and B is where the disease has invaded the lamina propria. I repeat, it has invaded the lamina propria, but it has not invaded the muscularis propria. Therefore, this has to be differentiated by the pathologist from a T2 disease on the basis of the level of invasion. If it has invaded the lamina and it has not invaded up to the muscularis propria, that is T1B. This differentiation is important because the T1A disease is less aggressive as compared to the 1B disease. 1B disease behaves more like an muscle invasive T2 disease. The other variety is carcinoma in situ, the CIS. We tend to see less of CIS in India, possibly because we are under diagnosing it based on purely conventional cystoscopy and the lesser use of blue light or cystoscopy. And it is felt that the increasing usage of blue light cystoscopy will help us to pick up more of CIS. And this is something we as practicing urologists should adopt more. And of course, Punlump, which is papillomas of low malignant potential. The genesis of non-muscle invasive disease is based on progressive genetic deterioration in normal epithelium. So, as this diagram shows us, normal epithelium, if it undergoes delay, the activation of the RAS pathway, it becomes a TA disease, and then further, if it gets a 9q deletion, it becomes a papilloma. However, a 9p deletion, that is the long arm deletion, will lead to T1, which deteriorates further into muscle invasive and possibly metastatic disease. However, if the initial uh, uh, changes in the pathway were at TP53 and RB genetic disorder, then it forms a carcinoma in situ. And when it has these deletions in 5q and 3p, it goes down the T1 pathway and then subsequently into T2 and metastatic. So what this tells us is that these are distinct diseases, TA, TR, and TIS. They are different signatures, genetic signatures of deletions and other changes in the genetic profile of these tumors. And so they are genetically discordant. They are not all same. All non-muscle invasive diseases are not the same. The Pathological classification has been updated in the 2004 ISUP classification, which has been adopted by the WHO as well. So these are the four groups which I alluded to: the papilloma, pendulum, low grade, and high grade. And I'd like to draw your attention now to these important figures. So, if we take to the first, that is the recurrence, the recurrences are fairly common in pendulum, low grade, and high grade as well. However, progression is not a very common feature of papillomas and pendulums. However, the stage progression becomes very, very uh, problematic, wherein there is a tendency of these tumors to become invasive, and this is more commonly seen amongst the high grade tumors. So, to summarize, papillomas, pendulums, and low grades tend to recur frequently, but there is no or very little progression in these tumors. Whereas high grade tumors not only recur, but they also have a stage progression. So a T1 may become a T2 disease. And therefore, the survival of these patients also is what you need to see. Very rarely does a patient die. So there's 100% survival from pendulum, papillomas, and low grade tumors. However, the survival at 15 years for high-grade tumors is only about 65 to 90%. So high-grade non-muscle invasive diseases behaves like a invasive disease. This was an important paper presented by Harry Hare in the year 2000, looking at the natural history of TA, T1, and these are the figures which they drew up at 15 years. So, patients with a TA disease of low grade have no deaths at 15 years. So, the progression free survival was 95%. However, TA disease of high grade at 15 years, this progression free survival was 61%, but the disease specific survival was 74%. This indicates there's a 25% mortality at 15 years from high grade TA disease. For T1 disease, the 15-year progression-free survival was 44%, but the disease survival was 62%, indicating a mortality of about 40% with T1 high-grade disease at 15 years. So, what is the utility of BCG? Our mainstay in the treatment arm for high-grade disease is the utility of BCG. If if you use BCG, BCG is able to reduce progression risk by about 30%. And this is a figure I'd like to keep in mind. Most of the guidelines would suggest to an assessment of the risk of recurrence and the risk of progression. And we have these. This has also been recommended in the EAU update of 2020. The most commonly used are the EORTC and the QTO calculators. These are available on the web. What I'd like to draw your attention is that EORTC, the data on this EORTC risk calculator was based on the use of intravesical chemotherapy only. So these patients who were selected for this particular um, calculator design were patients who have been treated only with chemotherapy. Whereas the QTO calculator is based on patients who have been treated by BCG, and therefore my feeling is that we should be looking more closely at, if we want to use a calculator, the QTO group, because the QTO calculator is those patients who have been treated with BCG and then follow up to draw these risk calculators. So what do these calculators tell us? They tell us what is the risk in an individual patient for him to develop a recurrence at 5 years and at 10 years, and then what is the risk of progression, and that gives us a clear understanding of how we can then counsel the patient. However, there are some flaws in both these calculators. The cohorts which were studied were not treated in the fashion we do today. That is that none of these patients had a repeat TURBT, which is probably the standard of care today, and they did not receive the single dose of post TURBT chemo installation, which is again the standard of care today. So there is a feeling that the recurrence rates which you get out of these calculators are possibly higher than what we will see today, because current practice today always maintains that a re-TURBT should be done and a single dose post-TURBT chemo installation should be standard of care. There are attempts to improve these risk calculators by the addition of molecular markers so that you can improve your positive predictive and negative predictive values when a patient is being counseled on these. However, these refinements in the calculators are still in development. Next, of course, is the evaluation. What all are we doing? What has changed in this is we all do urine cytology. We have asked the patient to do a freshly voided sample, not an overnight stored sample, and that is the best sample to be given to the laboratory. However, there is a lot of variation in the way pathologists report cytology, and the various terms like inadequate sample uh, um, uh, uh, or inadequate sample, dysplasia, atypia, these have been now more or less conformed into one system, and that system is what is recommended now to be used by all labs when reporting cytology. It's called the Paris system of reporting. And I feel that we should tell our pathologists when reporting, please report the cytology as in the standard format of the Paris fashion, the Paris system. The sensitivity of urine cytology is of the order of 28 to 100%. So there's a wide variation. It is a very low sensitivity when it is a low grade tumor, but it has a high specificity. So if it is positive, it is better for it is likely to be a high grade disease more than a low grade disease. What about the other alternatives to doing a urine cytology? There were tests conducted on voided urine like the NMP22, the BTA test, and the BTA stat test. All of these are FDA approved, and the advantages of using these tests are that they have a higher sensitivity. Therefore, they were thought that it would be a replacement for doing a urine cytology or possibly a cystoscopy. However, numerous trials have demonstrated that they have not been of sufficient positive and negative predictive value so that you can avoid doing a cytology. So these are not in routine use. So currently, possibly the role of doing these NMP22 or BTA stat tests is only in select patients of low risk, and that too for the possibility of trying to reduce the frequency at which we do cystoscopy. It is not recommended to be done for high risk disease. Now, there's been a lot of literature and there have been a lot of talk about the value of en bloc resection versus the standard piecemeal TURBT. Now, what is en bloc? It is removing the entire bladder tumor at one go, mostly by retrograde resection using various devices. So, what has been used? Lasers have been used, Collins knife has been used, a modified loop, which is a flattening out of our conventional loop, that has been tried. And in all these, the aim is to get down from the normal mucosa down to the level of muscle and then go retrograde and remove the whole thing in one chunk. The advantages, the advantages were that while in most cases in a piecemeal we do not go sufficiently deep, in a retrograde resection, since the base of the resection is detrusor, the positivity of detrusor in that dissection is almost about 90%. Obviously, since you have taken out the entire tumor in one go, the recurrence rates are lower. However, the progression rates of these are as much as in piecemeal. The advantage I feel that when you're doing an en bloc is that you may, if you have done a good job, avoid a re-TURBT. So when we're doing a cystoscopy, the aim is to map out the entire tumor Put it down on your case notes also where all the tumor has been located, the size, and the characteristics of the tumor, as well as noting the status of the ureteric orifices and the prostatic urethra. In those patients who are on the pathology report reported as a T1 disease or a high risk disease, then you need to go ahead and do a repeat TURBT. So let me focus a little bit on re-TURBT. This has been actually a practice recommended for many years now. And in a recent review in European Urology Focus, uh, what I was surprised to see is that the rates of residual disease when a second TURBT is done was conventionally thought to be about 30%, but it's now seen that the recurrence is up to 50%. That is, there's a 50% risk of residual disease even when the first TURBT, the primary TURBT, had Detuzo. So it means that in half the times that when you do a TURBT, there is still residual tumor left back. And therefore, it's important that you do a good quality TURBT. When you have a high grade or when you have a when you have a T1 disease, you have to do a re-TURBT. So the upstaging, however, on re-TURBTs with current standards of resection is about 11%. And I'd like you to keep these in perspective, and therefore consider doing a re-TURBT in all cases which are T1 or reported as a high grade on the pathology report. We most commonly follow the European urology standard of risk stratification. We have a low, intermediate, and high risk, and a fourth category, which is the highest risk. So these are the fairly clear guidelines of management have been based on this risk stratification. The low risk disease are those which are small, single, low grade with no carcinoma in situ, and as a primary, which is a very straightforward group. The high risk, the high risk are those which are T1 or CIS, those which have a high grade, or those which have a larger size. However, multiple recurrent or large tumors of low grade, these are also at high risk. And the highest risk tumors are those which are large, which are recurrent, which are multiple along with concurrent CIS. Also, bear in mind that if the pathology is reported as variant, for instance, micropapillary or tuberocystic, these are considered as the highest risk for progression. Also, the presence of lymphovascular invasion is very important to note. So, if the pathologist has reported lymphovascular invasion, these patients are immediately at the highest risk of progression, and I think this is what needs to be paid attention to also. Now, all guidelines uniformly report a single adjuvant dose chemotherapy after TURBT. Why so? Because the risk of recurrence is reduced by at least 11 to 50%. So there is a good reduction of recurrence by the single dose given post TURBT. What can be used? Most commonly we use mito or doxorubicin. To have its maximal effect, it should be given within 24 hours, and the best effects are obviously earlier, so within 6 hours. The reason is that the implantation time for the tumor is maximal within these hours, and if you give these doses after the implantation has already been established, then it's no point giving this therapy. So the treatment recommendations as per the EAU guidelines is further classified based on what risk the patient is. The first group is the simplest, the low risk disease group. These patients, you have given a single dose post URBT of mitomycin, they do not need any further therapy. So one single dose of chemotherapy given post URBT is adequate treatment. Next is to do a cystoscopy at 3 months. If that cystoscopy is negative, then you can follow up the patient next after 9 months, that is at the end of the first year. So there is no need for a low risk disease patient to come in for a check cystoscopy every 3 months for a year. No, it's not required. You do one cystoscopy at the third month after TURBT. If it is confirmed that it is clear, then the next cystoscopy can be deferred for a further 9 months. In those patients who are at intermediate risk, these patients need adjuvant treatment. What is recommended is that he should be put on chemo or BCG for at least 1 year. So let me repeat, if the patient is of intermediate risk, these patients have to be given further maintenance chemotherapy or BCG, the duration of which is at least 1 year. In those patients who are at high risk, these patients require a full 2 to 3 years of maintenance, and that too on BCG. We should not be using chemotherapy in these patients. Alongside intravesical chemotherapy or BCG, periodic cystoscopic surveillance is required. In most of these patients in intermediate or high risk disease, the cyclicity would be 3 months for 2 years, 6 months for 3 years, and then annually thereafter. BCG has been known for over 100 years, and these are the originators of the vaccine, Albert Calmette and Camille Guerin. How does BCG work? So, BCG works by inciting local immunity. We know that. So, after installation of BCG, the APC cells activate the T helper and the T suppressors. The T helper cells release interleukins and interferons, which activate the T cell immunity locally within the bladder. And this is the cycle of cytokines stimulation, which produces local immunity within the urothelium so that there is anti-tumor activity. So the reason why I put up this slide is that Dr. Ashish Kamath's group has now looked at the levels of these cytokines in the urine after BCG and have tried to come up with a score based on the levels of the cytokines to predict which patients on BCG are going to actually progress or which patients are going to be benefited after BCG installation. This is work still in progress, but it's important to know that is the direction of thinking. So the contraindications to BCG, well, BCG should be withheld for at least 2 weeks after the T or BT. If the patient has traumatic catheterization or there is hematuria, then we should not be given the BCG. Active tuberculosis or a history of sepsis in prior installations, again, is a no. Obviously, patients who have been immunosuppressed should not be given BCG. The standard dose used is 120 milligrams for each installation, which is to be retained in the bladder for up to 1 to 2 hours. However, there are some patients we find in our practice who will not be able to hold urine for at least 2 hours. That's all right. They should be advised to hold urine for at least 30 minutes for it to achieve sufficient contact within the bladder. There are certainly what are the benefits? The benefits of using intravesical BCG are like this. You achieve a 30% reduction in recurrence of a disease, whether it's intermediate or high risk. You have a 30% reduction. And the odds of progression are about 20%. So, again, about a 27 to 30% reduction in the risk that the BCG will progress. It delays systemic spread and it delays the development of metastasis. However, for these benefits to occur, what is important is that you need to keep the patient on maintenance therapy. So, just induction is not adequate. Some of the fallacies which had been in practice earlier, we used to turn the patient's position half an hour prone, then right lateral, then supine, then left lateral. So, this kind of rotation is not required for these patients. You need not have these patients go turning positions every. You need not have the patient turn position. The other thing is we advise the patients to reduce water intake for at least 4 hours prior to the installation. They should have they should empty their bladder before the therapy. And the other thing which I would like to stress is that very often we tend to shy from using quinolones or antipyretics in these patients, but it is quite safe to use quinolones because after BCG, these patients may have low-grade fever for a day or so. They may have bladder pain, so it's safe to use antipyretics. Give them some anticholinergics, along with a day or two of fluoroquinolones like levofloxacin or ofloxacin. So the induction with BCG, it was a 6 weekly installation, which was recommended in the initial LAM regime, and most often we used to use the Frappier strain, but now we do not get these strains. We get a strain which has not been specified by the manufacturer in India. The adverse effects on BCG are usually short lasting. They last about less than a week and can be easily managed by analgesics and antipyretics along with anticholinergics. The question about induction and the adequacy of induction. So, in some patients, we'll have to use a repeat 6 weeks dose of BCG, and that is when if you have a recurrent disease but it is low grade. There are sometimes cases where the disease appears long after your primary and maintenance. So, if a disease appears after a period of a year, you can use a second induction with BCG. Sometimes patients have their reappearance or persistence of carcinoma in situ. These patients, after if their primary disease was carcinoma in situ, you gave an induction, and then on follow-up, you found that there was still carcinoma in situ. So these are the patients you can do a second induction and then follow them up. By and large, a second induction with carcinoma in situ, you find that at least 40 to 60% of the patients will respond to it. So the maintenance schedule, we follow the LAMS regime, which is 3 weekly installations given at 3 months, 6 months, and thereafter every 6 monthly for a period of up to 3 years. And what is the rationale? The rationale is basically that while in induction phase, the cytokines of the urine, as I pointed out earlier, they start increasing gradually and peak at about 3 weeks. There is the development of the lymphocytic infiltration, and the patients demonstrate a delayed hypersensitive response. But all these tend to slowly peter down and weaken after 6 months. And therefore, for the efficacy of the BCG to be present in the bladder, it is required to give them the maintenance schedule. The adverse effects of BCG. BCG most commonly tends to produce irritant cystitis, and what is required, of course, is that you treat them with anticholinergics, but BCG should be continued. They will require sometimes NSAIDs to be administered. However, if the cystitis is of a severe intensity, then these patients, the BCG has to be suspended until the urine clears. Some patients some patients on BCG maintenance develop bladder contractures, which is an end-stage bladder. Those patients need a radical cystectomy. Epididymitis, prostatitis, or urethral infections, these need to be treated with fluoroquinolones and sometimes at least two-drug ATT. Other side effects, fevers, chills, or flu occurs and can be managed simply with NSAIDs. What we need to look at is the duration of fever and the grade. If it's a high grade fever lasting more than 2 days, these patients require discontinuation of BCG permanently. They will need to start it on 3-drug ATT, and we continue that for at least 3 to 6 months. If a patient develops frank tuberculosis or lung complications, you need to stop the BCG altogether. Next, I come to an important thing. See, up to now, I've talked about BCG, how to use the BCG, what are the doses, what is the maintenance and induction, and what is the maintenance schedule. So this is our front line in management. Now comes the question of, though, what do you do when you have BCG failure? So what is important is to first understand that what exactly are we talking about failure? Are all recurrences failure? No. In follow-up, if the patient's recurrence is of a low grade, that is not a BCG failure. No. So let me repeat. If there is a recurrence of disease after induction or maintenance of BCG, and that recurrence is of a low grade, that is not a failure, you can continue the BCG therapy. However, and the second point I'd like to stress is this: patients who are intolerant to BCG, so you have given them BCG, they have not been able to tolerate it. That does not mean that this is a failure of BCG therapy. All it needs is a modification of the dosing schedule or the dose itself, and therefore BCG failures does not include intolerance. Okay, so how often do you encounter BCG failure? We encounter BCG failure in about 40% of patients. So, in, put it another way, 60% of patients of intermediate or high grade disease will have no progression or recurrence, but in about 40% BCG fails. So, how do we treat BCG failure? BCG failure is a heterogeneous group, and there are different connotations. We have unresponsive, we have relapse, we have intolerance. So, what do you mean by this? So, let me take them one by one. BCG unresponsive. BCG unresponsive means that the patients who have had a BCG refractory disease, which means that you gave BCG, but the high grade tumor was still present at the third or sixth month. So this is BCG refractory, or where there was a recurrence which was high grade coming within 6 months. So these are BCG unresponsive. What is relapse? Relapse means that there was no tumor initially, and then the tumor reappeared. So if the tumor had an early relapse, that is in less than 6 months, this is high risk disease. But if the tumor recurrence was late, this is a low risk disease. And finally, BCG intolerance, which I just mentioned. The assumption before you label a patient of BCG therapy as a BCG failure is that you have given him adequate dose and for a sufficient period of time. And this has been standardized. So, what is adequate dose? An adequate dose is one induction plus maintenance cycle, which means that at least 5 doses of six. That means our induction schedule was 6 doses. So, at least 5 of these 6 doses have been given to the patient, as well as in the first maintenance cycle, you have given at least 2 out of those 3 doses. So, if you have provided the patient this complete schedule of one induction and one maintenance cycle, and yet the tumor reappears, that is BCG failure. So, this is important for us to understand. Giving 2 3 doses alone, stopping the therapy because the patient was intolerant, is not adequate BCG therapy, and that cannot be labeled a BCG failure. How do you treat BCG failure? Again, the failure of BCG is important for us to understand. Failure of BCG is that we now have run out of the standard options for treating the patient, and he is at high risk of about 20 to 30% risk of progressing to muscle invasive disease. Till date, the standard therapy for high risk disease is radical cystectomy. BCG failure standard therapy is radical cystectomy. Why do we say that? We say that because radical cystectomy in high risk BCG failure patients is curative. This patient is going to live his normal life if you give him a cystectomy early. So, against this gold standard, which is radical cystectomy done early, all other measures are inferior oncologically. What are the options that we can think about? There is chemotherapy, there is newer checkpoint inhibitors, there is the combination of hyperthermia with chemotherapy, and lastly, radiotherapy. So, the radical cystectomy treatment is definitely that for BCG failures. If there's a patient who's got the highest risk disease, which I alluded to earlier, which is T1, G3 with multiple large tumors, or if there's lymphovascular invasion, or there is a patient with a variant histology, these are patients who are the highest risk for any progression. So, if the patient who's in the highest risk group of classification of the person right at the outset of the disease, he must be counseled that you have the highest chance of progression to metastatic disease, so radical cystectomy becomes the treatment of choice. In the rest of the patients where there's a high grade recurrence, which is BCG refractory or with carcinoma in situ, radical cystectomy becomes your first treatment of choice. The options of bladder preservation, what can be the alternatives which can be suggested to the patient? Let's take them one by one. Let's start with intravesical chemotherapy. So, if BCG has failed, the only FDA approved drug was valrubicin. However, with time now, many other drugs in single or in combination therapy have been utilized intravesically for this group. To look at these figures further, valrubicin, the FDA-approved drug, it provides a disease-free status of only 16% at 1 year. So these are pretty low. Compared to that, now we have better drugs. Gemcitabine as a standalone gives you almost double the benefits of valrubicin. The DFS at 1 year is 27%, and when gemcitabine is combined with docetaxel intravesically, the DFS is almost 54%. And these are maintained at 2 years, so that the DFS at 2 years is about 34%. So it has been seen that there's a substantial benefit of combining two drugs, gemcitabine and docetaxel, given sequentially intravesically. This concept was further expanded. Now, a three-drug combination, which is mitomycin with dosi and cisplat, the results of which have been very promising. The DFS at 2 years is about 64%. At 3 years, sorry, the DFS at 3 years is about 64%. So this has been proven to be the most beneficial regime so far to be used in this setting of BCG failure. Next, I come to an important new therapy which we have got in our arm, which is Pembro. Pembrolizumab is was the subject of a lot of buzz on the cancer websites. The Keynote 57 trial was the one which really put Pembro on the front line of this therapy. And why did it get such a buzz? Why did it create such a buzz? That was because prior to the availability of Pembro as the immunotherapy for non-muscle invasive, there was actually not much option available, as I just pointed out. So Pembro was the first drug which was FDA approved for for utilizing in this specific uh, high risk disease, which is BCG failure disease. So a little details about the Keynote 57 trial. Here, this was a group of 105 patients with carcinoma in situ who were given at least 12 doses of BCG. And at 3 months, they had complete responses in about 40% of patients. And that was maintained for almost over a year. There were recurrences. 25% of the patients had recurrences, but none of these recurrences were muscle invasive or metastatic, meaning that the in this high risk of patients, utilizing pembrolizumab actually was able to alter the natural history of the disease so that the disease remained non-muscle invasive in all the patients, including those who had recurrences. Based on this keynote address, keynote 57, the FDA has approved Pembro as as first-line therapy for BCG recurrent diseases in the bladder. Using the success of pembrolizumab, there are other immunotherapy agents like Durva and Nivolumab, which are also being tested in this in the BCG refractory diseases. Next, I come to HIVEC. Now, HIVEC is a system which is being utilized in some centers. What is basically being done in this is by using microwave hyperthermia or device hyperthermia, you increase the intravesical pressure from between 42 to 48 degrees, and then the installation of mitomycin in these patients produces more depth of penetration and allows possibly a better response. So, I due to this article in a recent publication in Bladder Cancer by D. Jong, they used hyperthermia for intravesical installation in patients who had BCG failures. So 55 patients who had failed BCG or were BCG unresponsive, they were given at least 5 doses of HIVEC, and at about 17 months, so about a year and a half, the disease-free status was about 50%. So at least half of these patients could be salvaged. There were some recurrences in 42% of the patients, but only about 8% of these recurrences were metastatic. So HIVEC is being proposed as one of the lines of management for BCG refractory bladder tumors. Finally, I come to radiotherapy. What is the rationale and what is the status of radiotherapy? So, radiotherapy has been used in combination with chemotherapy for muscle invasive diseases. Naturally, the option of radiotherapy has been considered in those patients who have failed BCG as an alternative to cystectomy. But there is only very little data which is there, and most of this data have been conflicting. Two studies have shown that radiotherapy is beneficial, and one study has shown that it is not beneficial. So, what has been now studied is to add chemo to radiotherapy. So, you use concurrently mitomycin or 5-FU and cisplatin. The second kind of therapy being tried is to use radiosensitizers like Neupogen. And it is possible to also add checkpoint inhibitors. The rationale being that if you combine radiotherapy with checkpoint inhibitors, the radiation therapy will upregulate the PDL1 and therefore potentiate the subsequent addition of checkpoint inhibitors in this therapy. So I'll conclude this talk by highlighting the key points of what I would like to stress. The first important thing is to have a uniform system of reporting of the urine cytology. We should use the Paris system of cytology reporting. Next, I'd like to stress the use of risk calculators to assess what are the risks of recurrence and progression. And for this, what is recommended is to use the QTO risk calculators, which are available on the net. I have also stressed on the recent data which shows that re-TURBT is important to reduce the risk of recurrence and to correctly stage the disease so that we can plan the therapy. I've covered what is BCG failure, what is the time frame, which is and the doses of BCG to be given before calling it a failure. Basically, it is one induction and one maintenance cycle at least. In those patients where BCG has failed, we have now evidence that a combination of gemcitabine and docetaxel may be the most promising to use, at least for intravesical therapy in bladder preservation protocols using chemotherapy. And lastly, I have stressed on the Keynote 57, which was the first FDA approved drug in the checkpoint inhibitors for use in BCG refractory bladder cancers. I thank you very much for your time, and I trust this has been useful to people as a markup of all the recent advances in non-muscle invasive bladder cancer. Thank you very much.